Hi everyone, my name's Holly and I work for Dynamic Dunescapes and I'm based in Cumbria and I work for Cumbria Wildlife Trust. So Dynamic Dunescapes is a national project and we have lots of different partners, as you can see along the bottom, places like Natural England, the Wildlife Trust and National Trust, but I'm based with Cumbria Wildlife Trust. My role is as the engagement officer. And so I'm going to be talking to you a bit about the conservation works that have been going on in our dune systems in Cumbria and North Lancashire. And then we've got a couple of guest speakers as well who are going to be chatting about their work on the Dunescapes project. So we have a couple of bursary recipients who've been doing student projects. And then we have our volunteer coastal assistant warden called Patrick, who's going to share what he's been up to in his time with us. So just to start off, a little bit of an introduction. So for those of you who don't know, Dynamic Dunescapes is a national project and we are based in England and Wales, covering 34 different coastal sand dune sites. So in Cumbria and North Lancashire, we actually have 11 of those sites, which you can see just up here in the northwest. And our aims are really to restore sand dunes across England and Wales for the benefit of the wildlife there. And we're also hoping to restore it as well for the benefit of local communities and people. So why are we looking at sand dunes? Well, sand dunes are actually the habitat which are most at risk in Europe for biodiversity loss. So there are only about 20,000 hectares of sand dunes left in England and Wales. And this has been vastly reduced over time. So about a 60% reduction in sand dune area since 1900. So that's a huge amount of our coastal sand dunes which have been lost. And this is quite a bad thing, obviously, for the wildlife that live there, as we often have lots of threatened and rare plants and animals. So for example, butterfly species such as the small blue butterfly, and also plant species such as orchids, and rare amphibians as well, such as the natterjack toad, which is just pictured on the bottom left. And Ashley is going to talk to us a little bit more about her work, which involved the natterjack toad. But yeah, they are an important inhabitant of our sand dunes and have a bit of a stronghold here in the northwest. So they're quite important to our sand dunes here. As well as for wildlife, sand dunes are also really important for coastal communities. So they provide coastal protection from storms, from flooding, and also from erosion. But what exactly is the problem and why exactly are we losing these sand dune habitats? Well, until recently, management of sand dunes has been about stabilizing dunes. So you might have heard of this before. It's something that I commonly come across. People say that, you know, we want to stabilize the sand dune, reduce erosion, and often one of the management techniques was really to plant species of plants and fencing that would actually stabilize the sand dunes. But actually, we've realized this isn't necessarily a good thing. And so expert advice on conserving sand dunes has now changed. So new conservation management strategies are needed. So what we've found that because of our previous knowledge and the previous management methods, sand dunes are actually becoming too stable, and so they're not dynamic enough. And this is because they're being smothered by fixed rank vegetation. So because we have too much vegetation, we're losing these areas of bare moving sand, which we now realize is really important for some of our specialized dune animals and plants, like the natterjack toad. So before I explain what we've been doing in Cumbria, I thought I would just very briefly go over what exactly is a sand dune and how it forms. So sand dunes, basically, they form wherever there's an abundance of sand. So you get sand dunes in deserts, or more likely for the northwest of England, we get sand dunes along our coastline where we have lots of beaches. So to make a sand dune, the sea and action of the waves washes the sand up the beach. Then this sand is picked up by the wind and it blows it inland. And this sand actually accumulates around obstacles. So for example, plant species that we start to see on the strand line. And these form small dunes initially called embryo dunes or baby dunes. and these get larger and higher as we move backwards inland. So we see what's called mobile dunes. So these are areas where there's lots of bare moving sand and only some plant species. And in between these high dune peaks, we have dips known as dune slacks. And these are really important habitats, and we'll mention them a little bit later. But dune slacks are really important because they actually reach the level of the water table, which is fresh water. And so for part of the year, in particularly wetter months, these areas fill with fresh pools. However, they dry out during the summer, and so it forms a really unique habitat, which is really important for lots of different specialized species. Then moving backwards further inland, we start to see semi-fixed dunes, and these are dunes which have some bare moving sand, but start to see more vegetation. And then finally, we see fixed grassland, which is typical grassland where lots of different vegetation, but no bare sand visible. We also sometimes get some different habitats like dune heath. This is quite rare, but we can see some of it in the northwest. So for example, in Drigg, near Ravenglass and at Mawbray banks. And essentially there's nothing wrong with any of these habitats. They all do a really good job in their own right and form part of the ecology and different niches for different animals. However, what the issue is that we're seeing far too much of this fixed grassland. So because the dunes are becoming more stable, we have too much fixed grassland and actually are losing these mobile dunes. So what Dynamic Dunescapes aim to do is to restore the balance of these habitats and create areas of bare moving sand. So how have they become threatened and why are they starting to stabilise? So I've touched on this already. Part of this is due to past management techniques. So as I mentioned before, planting things like sea buckthorn in order to trap the sand in the roots and stabilise it. And also by putting in fencing, which stabilises a dune and stops it from shifting as it normally should. Climate change has also been a big factor in dune stabilisation. So we're seeing increased rainfall and temperatures, which has resulted in vegetation growing at a much faster rate, and also reduced wind speeds. Believe it or not, we have actually seen reduced wind speeds over time. It sometimes doesn't feel like that when I'm spending all day out on the beach. But yeah, over time we have seen reduced wind speeds, which is an issue for the wind not being able to pick up this bare sand and move it and form new dunes. We've also seen building developments, so human building developments, which are resulting in dune stabilisation. So this is where we've built around the dune system and coastal communities like housing developments and golf courses. And what this does is it artificially kind of stabilises the dune system. It stops it from being able to shift and move around the coast. And so it speeds up this stabilisation process. Invasive species have also become an issue. So I mentioned sea buckthorn, which is previously planted on our dune systems, but also Japanese rose, which you might be familiar with. And this causes a real issue because a lot of these invasive species really take over the dune systems. They grow really quickly and they bind the sand, which stops it from moving and smothers out our native dune species. We've also seen changes in grazing regimes. So over time, moving more to sheep grazing rather than a mixture of cattle and sheep or just cattle. And what we find is that cattle is actually better for grazing on sand dune sites because they're not particularly picky about what they eat. And so they're really important at keeping vegetation levels low and also churning up that sand by moving through it. We also see loss of rabbit populations resulting in dune stabilisation. And this is quite similar to cattle, so they're really good at keeping the vegetation levels low. And also by building burrows and warrens, they help churn that sand up and keep it mobile. So just to really illustrate what I've told you here, this is a picture taken from one of our sand dune sites, Sandscale Hawes, which is close to Barrow. The picture on the left here is from 1946, and it's an aerial photograph. And the areas in red that you can see are actually areas of bare sand. And then when you compare it to this picture taken in 2018, you can see that the areas of bare sand is now only restricted to very close to the beach. So you can see that huge loss of bare sand here. And it's actually reduced from about 37% of the area to less than 2% of the area in only about 70 years' time. So that's kind of the issue, particularly what's going on in Cumbria. So next I thought I'd tell you a little bit about some of the conservation works that we've been doing and the techniques that we've been doing as well to restore these sand dune sites. So our project has been running since 2020, and we're in the final year of our project now in 2023. We cover 11 sites, so from Groon Point in Skimbeness in the north near Silith. Then moving southwards, we have Mawbray Banks. Moving further south, we have Drigg and Eskmeals, and then Havrig, Askham, Sandscale Hawes, and then we have North Walney and the west of Airfield site in North Walney. South Walney being our most southerly point in Cumbria, and then finally Fleetwood, which is located in North Lancashire. So what we've been doing at these sites is aiming to restore the balance of these sand dune habitats by reducing areas of fixed rank vegetation and promoting and protecting habitats for rare dune species. So the first of the methods that we've been using is turf stripping. So I've got a picture here just on the right, which shows some of the sites that we've been doing this on in Cumbria. And basically, turf stripping is pretty much as it sounds. You use a mechanical digger, pictured here, in order to scrape away the top layer of fixed rank vegetation in order to reveal the bare sand underneath. And this is really important as it's able to allows the sand and the sand dunes to begin their succession again. So starting by forming mobile and embryo dunes. So this example was taken from South Walney. The picture here is before the turf stripping was done. So you can see there's lots of fixed vegetation, lots of grass, lots of bracken. Then this picture was taken shortly after we've used the turf stripping. And you can see it does look a little bit of a mess. Sometimes it's hard to believe how it's going to recover after something quite as drastic. But you can see only 2 years after, we have this really nice sand dune habitat where you're starting to see areas of bare moving sand and beginning to see some specific dune plant species. So we've been doing some vegetation quadrat surveys in some of our sites, and at South Walney, we've actually seen an increase in flora diversity of about 50%, which is really good to see that our turf stripping has been working really well there. The next type of intervention that we've been working on is pond creation and restoration. So again, this is something that Ashley is going to tell you a little bit more about. But basically, I mentioned the dune slacks, and they form these transient pools. And we want to make sure that these pools do flood with water over the winter months, and also that they dry out as well in summer. And this is because it's really important habitat for our natterjack toads. So natterjack toads are really easily identified by this yellow stripe along their back, and they're specially adapted to live and breed in these transient freshwater pools. And that's because they have quite a quick life cycle, so they develop very quickly, unlike common frogs and common toads, which need water in their pools all year round. So having these dune slack pools on our sand dunes is really important so that the natterjack toads don't have to compete against the common frog and common toad in order to survive. So we've been creating and restoring pools which already exist in a number of our sites. And this is an example taken from Mawbray Banks. So at Mawbray, we've been working with the Solway Coast AOMB, and we've created 3 pools and have restored one of the pools as well, which was already there. And these pictures were taken last year from people who just happened to come across our natterjack toads which is really great to see. We've had a very successful breeding season last year, so it'll be good to see how it turns out again this year. I will also mention natterjack toads are really rare. They're also a protected species, so it's important that people don't go out actively looking for them, and that's because it can damage their habitat, and they are very small, so they can be quite easy to step on. So it's really important that we don't disturb them, and you do actually need a license to go out and look for them and monitor them. But we do run some walks during their breeding season, which I'll mention at the end of the talk. So you'll be welcome to come along and help with monitoring. Okay, so our next section, again, part of Ashley's project, which she'll mention, and that's conservation grazing and invisible fencing. So as I mentioned, cattle are really important at keeping that vegetation level low. And they are located on a number of our sites. So we had cattle on our sites previously for when the Dunescapes project started at, for example, Drigg, South Walney and Sandscale Hawes. However, what we've done is introduce invisible fencing, so no fence collars, on 2 cattle herds at North Walney and at Mawbray banks. And these are quite important. So this invisible fencing is what's known as a no fence collar. So the cows wear this collar, and it's used for site managers to be able to track them. So they have an app and they're able to see where their cows are at all times. And you're also able to create exclusion zones and be able to make sure the cows don't stray from a particular area without the need of electric fencing or physical fencing. So what the collars do is give them a small electric shock, which deters them from going outside of their remit and site bounds. And this shock, it might sound a little bit kind of strange, but actually it's much less harsh than using electric fencing, and the shock is only quite small and they do learn very quickly. So yeah, these have been introduced in 2 of our sites. And they're acting as a bit of a trial run to see how well they do to be introduced in future sites as well. Another one of our methods is scrub removal. So this can be done by diggers, but is often done by hand as well. And we've done a scrub removal on pretty much all of our sites, but this example is taken from Havrig near Millom. In Havrig, we've removed about 17.3 acres or 7 hectares of scrub overgrowth. So you can see in 2019, before the project started, there's large areas of gorse and fixed vegetation. And then this was taken shortly after we've done the scrub removal in 2021. And you can see areas of bare sand opening up, and we're starting to see lots of specific dune species. So you might be able to see the sea holly just in the back here. So that's that silver prickly plant. And we're also seeing areas of Dune pansies. So these are really lovely kind of purple, small violets, which are in bloom in spring and autumn. So if you haven't seen them already, I'd recommend going down in spring to have a look at those. And you can see them on a lot of our different sites, not just Havrig. And then finally, one other method that we've been working on is invasive species removal. So again, this is something that we've done on pretty much all of our sites. However, the one that I've chosen to show you is Fleetwood, as this is where we have the most extensive amount of invasive species. And in this case, it's the Japanese rose, also known as Rosa rugosa. So Japanese rose, you might have seen it before, is this really lovely pink flowered plant. However, it is a real issue for sand dunes. As you can see in this picture taken from Fleetwood, it forms this really dense thicket of bushes which completely smother out the sand dunes. And Richard, our project officer, took this picture, and you can see the sea holly being sort of crowded out by the Rosa rugosa here. So yeah, in Fleetwood, we have quite a lot of Rosa rugosa, and we've worked over this past summer with Wyre Council to spray about 4.5 acres or 1.4 hectares of Japanese rose with a specific herbicide. And this will be followed up again in next summer. Okay, so that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour of our conservation methods in Cumbria. If you do have any questions, just pop them into the chat and we'll get to them at the end. But what I thought I'd then move on to chat about is some of the work our student projects have been doing. So we've had a number of student bursaries which have been awarded to students to run their own projects. And we'll be hearing from Jenna and Ashley. So Jenna isn't actually able to make it today, but she did pass on her data and slides. So I'm going to go through that for Jenna on her behalf. We also have Patrick, who's coming along to chat to us today. And he is our volunteer. He's been with us for about 4 months now. So he's going to be talking about some of the work that he's been doing at South Walney. We have also had 2 students just recently start. So they're only quite new to their project, so I thought it was a little bit cruel to come and ask them to come and present what they've got so far. But basically we have Faith, who's investigating the historical and cultural heritage of sand dunes. She started just last week. And then we have Alice, who is an artist. And this is a picture of some of the work that she's been doing. And Alice is hoping to raise awareness of priority beetle species that we find in sand dunes by creating a manga comic and then distributing this out. So this is a picture of Alice just at the bottom here doing some of her beetle surveys earlier, well, last year actually now. And then this was a picture that she created. So the character that she's created from the Northern Dune tiger beetle. So this was inspired by one of our beetle species, which is particularly rare and is only found in Drigg, and also one other place on the Sefton coast as well. So it's really rare and quite a special kind of flagship species for our Cumbrian dunes. But yeah, I'm excited to see how Alice gets on with that comic, as it's something that's a little bit different. So I think we'll hand you over to Patrick, who's going to be telling you a little bit about what he's been doing at South Walney. Patrick, if you want to let me know when you want me to change the slides, just give me a shout.
Oh yeah, will do. Hi, I'm Patrick. I'm the Coastal Volunteer Assistant Warden down here at South Walney. I've been down here for, as Holly said, about 4.5 months now. Working down on the reserve here with the warden and Holly, helping out Holly with the project down here. Well, the Dynamic Dunescapes down here at South Walney as well as Havrig and occasionally Sandscale as well. Do you mind going to the next slide, Holly? So yeah, came in to talk about the seals down here at South Walney. The seals here are the only grey colony in the whole of Cumbria. The reason, so like they like to come to South Walney due to the low disturbance level, we believe to be the low disturbance levels, as there is no access to the spit where they like to reside, as well as possibly there's a wind farm just off the coast here, so they also potentially could be here for the abundance of fish which generally live around the base of the turbines. We've had a lot of colony growth here over the, I can't remember how many years it is now, I think over the last 20-30 years. The colony has grown from 5 elderly male seals, and has gradually grown up to over 500 seals, which was, I believe, the record count on a seal survey last year. Last year. So yes, there's been a lot of colony growth, which we're really happy with. And we're even happy with the fact we've had 4 seal pups born this year. They're now lost all their fur though. So yeah. With the grey seal surveys, we use a drone as well as doing a ground survey. So we fly the drone above the colony high enough so that we don't disturb them and cause the least amount of disturbance as we possibly can. Take a few photos, and then when we take those pictures back, we do a count of how many seals we counted from the drone shots. The ground surveys we perform here are we crawl up to a certain point close to the colony as not to disturb them. There's like a lip downwards. We sort of stay on the flat here and sort of peek above the shingle to be able to see them, to see the colony, not to disturb them as well. So we perform those counts over the ground count over the space of an hour, doing a count every 10 minutes, and then we record that down and compare it to the drone survey. Next slide, please, Holly. Okay, so these are pictures from a recent seal survey down here at South Walney. So sort of the right side picture is sort of a wider shot of as much of the colony we could fit in as possible, and then sort of this, then the left picture is a closer up picture, which we generally of a portion of the colony. So we take multiple pictures of the colony more up close like this, so that we can perform the count. As the wider sort of span shots, we're less able to see in detail how many sails there are on the beach. I believe there were, on this particular survey, from the ground counts, we were getting about 140, when realistically there was probably double that actually on the beach. So around 280 to 300 seals, I believe, were counted from the drone shots. And then I believe that's next slide. Yeah, so thank you for listening. That's just a brief overview of the seals and seal surveys we perform down here at South Walney.
That's great, thanks Patrick. Yeah, it's quite interesting, some of the different species that we get on our sand dunes, from kind of the northern dune tiger beetle all the way to grey seals. So yeah, I'll briefly talk about Jenna's project. Hopefully I do it justice, I'm sure she'll tell me. So yeah, Jenna has been working at Fleetwood sand dunes, and her project is looking at the impact of Japanese rose, or Rosa rugosa, and I will just call it Rosa rugosa from now on. It is kind of easier, flows off the tongue a little bit better. So she was looking at the impact of Rosa rugosa on sand dune biodiversity. So she was working at Fleetwood, which is managed by Wyre Council. And Fleetwood sand dunes are a little bit different. So that's because they have this concrete promenade which runs right in the middle of our sand dunes. But I think it illustrates quite well the difference between these two different habitat types. So you can see on the left, this is the natural sand dune area, which has lots of native species. And then in comparison to the sand dunes on the right, and all of this area that you can see, this brown plant, is Japanese rose, so Rosa rugosa. And you can see just how far it stretches back into the distance. So this picture was taken just after it was sprayed with herbicide, so it is dying back. But you can really see how dense that thicket is. So obviously it's really difficult for anything underneath to grow. So the aims of Jenna's project have been look at Rosa rugosa, and that's because it's classed as an invasive species to sand dunes. So it was introduced to the UK about 150 to 200 years ago from Southeast Asia. And it was brought over as an ornamental plant for people's gardens. And you can see why from this really nice pink flower, and it also smells really nice as well. And while it's really lovely in people's gardens and even on roadside verges, it does cause a huge problem for our sand dunes. And that's because, as I mentioned, it grows really quickly and it smothers out those native species. And previously, management techniques at Fleetwood have been to manually remove the plant and flailing, but you can see just how dense it is, and it's really, really difficult for it to be removed by manual removal alone, as it can grow back from even just a small area of root left in the sand. And so the current management methods that we've been working on last summer is to spray it with a specific herbicide. So this herbicide targets only woody plants like Rosa rugosa, so it doesn't target other plants, and it also isn't harmful to insects like bees, and not to mammals either, so us and dogs included. So yeah, Jenna wanted to look at the flora and fauna biodiversity And so in order to do that, she picked two different areas on the sand dunes. The first area is where there's no Rosa rugosa, so it's not present. And then the second area is where Rosa rugosa is present. And to study biodiversity, she used a number of different methods. So she did vegetation quadrat surveys, which you can see on the bottom left. So this was a 1 meter by 1 meter square, and she picked about 3 to 6 sample areas for each of those two types, and then recorded all the plant species which were found in that quadrat. She then also did some sweep netting, which was to capture and identify flying insects such as moths, butterflies, and bees, and then pitfall traps. And this is a picture here of what a pitfall trap looks like on the bottom right. So these are containers which are dug into the earth, and they collect ground-dwelling insects such as spiders, beetles, and snails. So these are Jenna's results. So this was, first of all, the results from the vegetation survey. So this pie chart shows the different species of plants that she found in areas where there's no Rosa rugosa. So you can see that there's a huge different number of species, and the numbers here just indicate the percentage cover in that quadrat area. So we have species like sea holly, common rest harrow, marram grass, and bird's foot trefoil, which are all dune-specific plants. And then this is in comparison to areas with Rosa rugosa present. And you can really see, just looking at that pie chart, how different they are and how less diverse the areas are with Rosa rugosa. So on that right pie chart, we see that in these quadrats, about 82.5% is made up just of Japanese rose. And there are a few other species present, but in much lower quantities. And this again is just a reminder of what those quadrats looked like. Then looking at her invertebrate surveys. So this bar chart is looking at the average number of different species that were present in the quadrats. So you can see where there's no Rosa rugosa, we've seen about, Jenna, seen about 7 different species present in those quadrats, which is significantly higher than what's seen in areas where Rosa rugosa is present. So we'd see about 3 on average different species in those quadrats. And those species included things like the common blue butterfly, wolf spiders, and white-tipped bumblebees. So that was particularly more in the where Rosa rugosa wasn't present. Compared to where Rosa rugosa is present, we'd still see occasional butterfly species and the occasional bee, but again, this was in much lower quantities. And so putting this data together, Jenna looked at the biodiversity index, which just looks at the number of different species and the spread. And Jenna realized that actually in areas where there is no Rosa rugosa present, it's significantly higher biodiversity. So from this, she concluded that sites where Rosa rugosa is present has a significantly lower flora and insect biodiversity compared to areas with no Rosa rugosa at Fleetwood sand dunes. And this is really important, as it suggests that it's a really good reason to remove this invasive species in order to promote biodiversity. So Jenna's next steps will be looking at how the sand dunes recover from this herbicide. So I didn't mention this, but actually she's been looking at a number of different areas and how Rosa rugosa was then removed. So for example, some of the areas she will have Rosa rugosa removed by the specific herbicide that I mentioned. In another few areas, we're using a non-specific herbicide, and then another area looking, which is just going to be physically removing the Rosa rugosa. So this picture was taken before the herbicide was added, and you can see just very faintly where those marker canes are. And then this is 6 weeks after herbicide, so you can see it's dying back. And then a close-up of the sand dunes about 10 weeks after, where you're starting to see this bare sand opening up again. So yeah, Jenna's going to be having a look over next summer to see how the sand dunes are recovering and compare those different areas. And then hopefully will be something that we look at long-term as well. Okay, right. So I'll pass you on to Ashley now, and she'll tell you a bit about her project.
Thanks, Holly. I'll try and keep this as short as possible. So my name's Ashley. I did my undergrad dissertation with the University of Cumbria on cattle grazing and the effects it has on natterjack toad habitat. So looking at whether it'll improve it or if it makes a difference or not. So this is a photo of the cattle that Holly mentioned at Mawbray Banks. There was a herd of 8 of them, I think. Very lovely cows. Would recommend going to see them if you have the chance. They're very friendly. So I was quite lucky in the sense that when I was starting to think about doing my dissertation, that Solway at AOMB were thinking about putting the cattle on site. So it was quite a nice opportunity to go there and assess the habitat and see if there was any changes made within a short period of time. Next slide, please, Holly. Yeah, so a little bit of background about the natterjack toad, which Holly's already sort of touched on. Just sort of why is it important to look at this? So natterjacks are only native to 22 countries in Western and Northern Europe. And they are abundant in their southern regions, but the northern populations are declining, especially in the UK. But the Northwest is recognised as a stronghold for natterjack toads. So we have the largest population up here in Cumbria, in particular the Sefton Coast as well. I think they have a really good population down there. But the reason for declining is historical loss of habitat in the UK. So sand dunes weren't always protected. So this led to developments and loss of habitat in that regard. But then they were classed as triple SIs, which is a special site of scientific interest, which now you can't develop on those areas. So the habitat is protected as well as the natterjack toad. And they are a European protected species as well, and fully covered under the Wildlife and Countryside Act. So they are fully protected and you can't disturb them, as Holly said, and you do need a license to work with them. Next slide, please. So as I said, my study site was Mawbray, which was a really lovely site to do my dissertation research on. As you can see on the left, there is a map of Mawbray. So the red line area is Mawbray Banks, and the blue line area at the top there, that is what I called Mawbray North. So to do my research, I decided to compare the two areas to decide whether it was a compatible baseline study to compare each site to. So I really wanted to compare Mawbray Bank to Mawbray North to see if there was any changes with the cattle and a site without the cattle. So that really controlled any environmental, I can't think of the word, environmental factors that might change the area and the habitat. So as Holly said earlier, Mawbray Bank is currently in decline, and it has been historically, and the cattle have been introduced to improve that sand dune quality and to churn up all of the sand and to sort of make it more suitable and create that moving sand dune again. So what I did, I went and monitored the terrestrial and the aquatic habitat of natterjack toads. So I looked at any changes in height, disturbance within the quadrats. So disturbance isn't always a bad thing. It just shows that the cattle are making these bare sanded areas that we really need in sand dune systems. And I looked at the aquatic habitat as well, and that was sort of looking at the disturbance within that aquatic habitat, which again, that could be a bad thing, but there is more research that is needed for that. So I also used historical natterjack data provided by Arc Trust to map out which pools the natterjacks were favouring at Mawbray Banks. and I used the no fence maps produced by the collars to monitor cattle movement as well. Next slide, please, Holly. Okay, so what I found from my surveys and my research was that Mawbray and Mawbray North had a similar soil and vegetation composition, so it's a perfect control site to measure increased nutrients. So like Holly mentioned earlier, increased nitrogen can fix the sand dunes. So it was really perfect to sort of monitor that change, the environmental change. I also found that there was no change in vegetation at Mawbray Banks, but my study was it was less than a year long, so we're not going to really see any changes so quick, but it does provide that sort of baseline data that we can then compare to either yearly or 5 years down the line to see how the cattle are making that difference. Terrestrial disturbance did increase over the survey period, which is a good thing. So this means that the cattle on Mawbray are doing their job, and they're creating those bare sand areas, and the bare sand is predicted to increase with the cattle introduction. So they are doing a good thing there. Pool disturbance didn't vary, so it was around. The cattle did use the pools, and you could see that by the hoof prints in the pools in the top left photo there. So this shows that they are using them, and it could possibly create disturbance within the natjac population. But I believe the graziers at Mawbray have changed the no fence map, so they're trying to exclude the cattle from the pond areas. Is that right, Holly?
Yeah, they've excluded them from all of the pools apart from one that they use to sort of drinking and bathing.
Perfect. Yeah, and hopefully that way. I know there was some concerns that it wasn't quite accurate around the pools because they're quite small, but that is a really good way of making sure that actually the cattle are keeping out of the important bits and still grazing the areas around it as well. Yeah, so pools 1 and 2 were used the most, and I think on the next slide there is a map where I can show you this. And then on the bottom photo there shows the disturbance. So this is my secondary data. So this is my natjac data and the no fence data. So on the left is the natjac activity from 2012 to 2021. So this was provided by Arc Trust. And I made a map on QGIS to show the ponds that they were found breeding in the most. So this was ponds 2, 3, which I believe were the ponds that were used the most, and they were recorded most in those areas. Pond 1, and then there's another pond 5 at the northern end, but that's it's a more vegetated area. It's not a sort of dune slack sandy pond area, so they haven't been recorded in that. I'm not sure if they'd been recorded in that previously to 2012, but from 2012 they hadn't been recorded in the north from surveyors. So then on the right, this is what the maps look like for the cattle. So I can't remember the dates for this, but these were taken weekly and monthly, so I used the ones that represented the best activity movements of the cattle. So you can see that these little red areas are where they like to be the most, and these areas were where the most vegetation was. And sort of in the middle bits where there's less activity, these are sort of where the pools are as well. So you can see that they are using them, but not as variably as these dense vegetated areas, which is great for the habitat restoration. Obviously, I did have data showing that they were using the pools, so they were using them, just not as much as maybe these denser areas. Next slide, please, Holly. So next steps, I would really like to continue with the monitoring of the habitat to turn it into a long-term study. Is using cattle for habitat management effective? There's limited studies that show it, and I would really like to find out and to have that research on paper there, ready for people to use. And obviously it's for a really good cause to conserve natterjack toads, which are personally my favourite. I love them. And should we use cattle grazing as a standard habitat management for natterjacks? We're not really quite sure how to manage habitat for natterjacks. We know what they like and we know what they need, but there's not as much research done on it. I would really like to also monitor the pool quality as well. So I wasn't allowed to do anything with the pools because I wasn't licensed. So I am working towards my license, but I can also work as an accredited agent on Solway AOMB's license to do the water quality. So this would be looking at nitrogen in the water, increased nutrients that might cause it to become poor quality essentially, and to monitor that. And I think it would be really important for natterjacks to create a standard method for natterjack habitat assessment. So my method was sort of a mix between a vegetation survey and what Arc Trust used to assess a habitat for natterjacks. It wasn't a sort of standard, we have natterjacks here, we're going to assess the habitat like you have for great-crested newts. They have a habitat suitability index. Natterjacks don't have that, so I think it would be really good to work towards that standardization of a method for natterjack habitat assessments. Yeah, thank you for listening. That's me.
Thanks very much, Ashley. Yeah, if you've got any questions about any of those projects, just pop them into the chat and we'll come to them at the end. Okay, so just a bit of a summary of conservation in Cumbria and North Lancashire. So as I mentioned, invasive species removal and follow-up, introducing cattle to graze and these invisible fencing, no fence collars, pond creation and restoration for breeding natterjack toads across multiple different sites, as well as turf stripping and scrub removal to get rid of this excess fixed vegetation, particularly around the pools of the natterjack toads. So what's next for Cumbria and North Lancashire? Well, we're going to be doing follow-up invasive species clearance, so keeping on top of any invasive species which make their way back. So this will be done by contractors and also dedicated volunteers, which we have on a number of our sites. So for example, at Sandscale Hawes, we have National Trust volunteers who work really hard to maintain the sand dunes there. We're also setting up a volunteer group at Havrig, who will be working to remove any last little bits of Rosa Rugosa there. So if anyone wants to get involved, we'll be more than happy to show you what to do, and yeah, it'd be really appreciated. We'll also be monitoring natterjack toads and their ponds alongside the Amphibian and Reptile Conservation Trust. So as we mentioned, you do need a license to do that. So we have a license with Dynamic Dunescapes, and I'll be running walks at Havrig, Mawbray and Sandscale over their breeding season, so in like May sort of time. And yeah, if you would like to come along, the events are all free, and you can help with monitoring of natterjack toads then. So the booking links aren't currently live. They'll be going on at the end of February on Cumbria Wildlife Trust page. So yeah, keep an eye out for that. We are also doing some audio guides. So once the project finishes, we won't be doing sort of engagement events directly at any of our sites. So we're working to set up audio guides, which will be free for the public to use at Mawbray, Drigg and Sandscale Hawes. So talking about the wildlife that we specifically have in those sites, the conservation methods that have been used, and also a little bit about the history and the kind of cultural significance of the area, and chatting to some of the locals who live around those sand dune sites. And then finally doing some monitoring and long-term management through citizen science. So our citizen science project is a 10-year monitoring programme, and this is volunteer driven and volunteer led. So we run them on 4 different sites, so Mawbray Banks in the north, then Sandscale Hawes, South Walney and Fleetwood. And volunteers are asked to collect data on the dune profiles, so looking at the angle of the slopes, then also zonation mapping, so mapping where we have those different habitats to make sure that we've got a good healthy spread, and also doing vegetation quadrats, which you can see in this right picture of me and one of our wardens at Sandscale Hawes. This is really looking at vegetation cover, height, and looking for indicator species which indicate health of the dunes. So yeah, this is a 10-year monitoring programme, and all that data that's collected will be fed back to site managers, who will then use that data to see if the conservation efforts are working, or if more conservation techniques are needed in that area to top up what we've done so far. So again, this is for the public, anyone can get involved. We have also been involved in some local secondary schools and getting them to adopt a sand dune, where they will come back year after year gathering data on the sand dunes, which is part of the curriculum for them and also really helpful to us as well. So yeah, if you would like to get involved or find out more about some of the events that we're running and different activities, have a look on our website, which is dynamicdunescapes.co.uk. We're also on social media, so Facebook and Instagram at Cumbria Dunes, or you can drop me an email at hollys@cumbriawildlifetrust.org.uk.